Hello and welcome to the IT Lab, where we build and test IT solutions. Today we'll be looking at Entra App Proxy. We'll be using Entra App Proxy to access on-premises web apps without the use of a VPN or any special firewall rules. The solution comprises of three components. One is the private network connector, which is essentially an agent that's installed on a Windows server that has line of sight to the web apps you want to give access to. Also, you need to configure an app in Entra which creates an enterprise application. The third component is the application proxy service, which runs in the Microsoft tenant, and that doesn't require any special configuration or any input from us. To show you how this works, I've taken the diagram from the Microsoft website, and it shows that on premises you'll have the apps installed on servers. You'll have other servers to set up the connectors, which are the agents, and those then connect to Entra in the cloud, outbound only, and that connects to the enterprise app in Entra, which then generates a public endpoint so that the end user can access the internal web app. There's many benefits to using Entra App Proxy, and the main ones I would say are it's very simple to set up, it's quite cost effective, especially if you already have a premium Entra license, and there's no special configuration or infrastructure required apart from those agents that need to be installed on a Windows server. All communication is outbound, so it's very secure as well. Let's take a look at the lab environment. Obviously, we'll need a Microsoft 365 tenant. The licenses required, as I've mentioned, is an Entra Premium license. So you can see that I have a premium license on my test tenant here. In terms of on-premises, we need to have some web servers up and running, and we need to have DNS, and we also need a local certificate authority so that we can use HTTPS internally. I've listed the servers that I've set up. There's a DNS server that I've set up, which is called DNS01. I've set up a local certificate authority server, which has issued the two web servers internal certificates. I've also set up a web app server, which is called intranet01. That's basically going to simulate a company intranet site, and the app itself is using WordPress. And then I've got another web app server which is called KB01, and it's using the Bookstack app, and this is to simulate a Knowledgebase for the company. I also have a Windows server installed, which is the one that's going to have the agent server installed that will connect to the Entra App Proxy service. For this example, I've also set up a custom domain within my test tenant. As you can see, I've got that set up within my tenant. Let's take a look at the lab steps. First of all, I'll walk you through the on-premises environment I've created. We'll install the connector agent, we'll configure the intranet web app, we'll test whether it works externally, we'll also then configure the Knowledgebase web app, we'll test the external connection, and then we'll also configure App Launcher, which makes it easier for end users to find the apps that you've published via Entra App Proxy. So it's important that the server with the agent installed has DNS access to the internal web servers that have the apps installed on them. So this is the server that's going to have the agent installed, and I use PowerShell in this video to confirm that DNS is working. So first of all, I'm just showing that I'm on that server, and then I'm going to do a resolve DNS name on the DNS01, which is the DNS server, and that has an internal IP address. I'm then going to check that I can get to intranet01, and that also has an IP address internally. I'm going to check KB01, and I can see that yes, I can get to it via DNS, but there's a special case in terms of this one because I've also given it another DNS name. This is because I want to match the DNS name I've got internally with the one that I've got externally, which is why I've also added a custom domain within my tenant. So you can see if I go via the internal DNS server, it still is able to find the same server as KB01. It's actually the same server. So internally, users will be able to get to that server and access the application internally. But if anybody's accessing it externally, it will go via the custom domain that I've already registered. Right, so let's get to installing the connector agent. There are two things that we need to do beforehand if you're using a Windows Server 2019 version and onwards, and that's what I would recommend anyway. There's a setting to enable HTTP 2.0, and that's the PowerShell command to do that. And also we need to enable TLS 1.2 on the server. And finally we need to download the agent from Entra so we can install it on the server. Let's take a look. So I'm going to open up PowerShell, run it as administrator, and then run that PowerShell command to enable HTTP 2.0. I'm then going to create a reg file with those registry settings. And I'm just going to call it reg.reg. It doesn't really matter what I call it. And now I can run the reg command for that file that I've just created within PowerShell. That will add the entries within the registry. And my final step is that I need to go into Entra and I need to go into Enterprise Applications, and from private network connectors I want to download the connector service. By logging into your tenant, this is how the agent knows which tenant it's supposed to be connecting to and which apps it's supposed to be allowing access to. And on the server itself, if I search for services Entra, you'll see that there's two services running. And one is the connector and one is the connector updater. So the connector will update itself on a regular basis to make sure that we've got the latest version running. And you can see now that server 02 is active. Just a point to note, I did try and also install this on Windows Server Core, which is why you have server 01 there, but it doesn't work in Windows Server Core at this moment in time. So maybe it might in the future, but at the moment you must install it on a Windows server with the graphical user interface or desktop experience. Let's take a look at the web app internally first. So this is from the internal server. If I type in intranet 01, that's the website itself. And I'm going to copy the URL so that I can use it in the configuration within Entra. So in Entra, I go to private network connectors and then I say configure an app. Here I'm going to put the name of the app and I'll call it intranet. And I'll paste that URL in. This is the internal URL. And then I can give it an external URL and I'll just call it intranet with that extension on the end. And the authentication will be Microsoft Entra ID. I'm going to turn off the backend SSL certificate validation because it's an internal server. And what it's actually done is create an enterprise application in Entra. It also will register the app within Entra as well automatically. Now we want to test whether we can access the app externally, but before we can do that, we need to give access to the apps to users and groups. So let's do that now. And I'm also going to grab the external URL and test it on another computer. Once the user logs into Entra, we can see that the application is accessible externally. But there is one problem. The internal links, like the link for the homepage, is still pointing to the internal name. So in order to sort that out, we need to translate those URLs into the external one generated by Entra Proxy. And the way to do that is to tick this box here, translate URLs in application body. And if we do that and then we test it again, we should find that the internal links are now translated into the external link. So you see there, it's now showing the external link when I hover over the home button. When I click on it, it does go to the right place. Now let's look at this next app, and we're going to configure this in the way that Microsoft recommends, which is to match the internal DNS name with the external DNS name so we don't have problems with link translation. So let's configure an app within the Entra Proxy settings. We'll call this Knowledgebase, and we'll put the internal URL in here, and it's going to be the one that I set up with stech.systems. I'll change this to match the internal name using that custom domain that I have on this tenant, and then I'll leave the rest of the settings as they are. And also I can leave the backend SSL certificate where it is, because I have an external certificate which I have for my external domain. Now that's set up, what we need to do is just give it the external SSL certificate that I've set up. So we go back into Application Proxy and I can add the certificate here. If you want to learn about certificates and how this is all set up, there is another video on my channel that you can check, and that takes you through the process of setting up an internal certificate authority, and that will give you a lot of information as to how this works. So that's now uploaded, and if I check, I can see my certificate is uploaded there. The last thing I need to do is I need to put in a DNS name on my external domain, and that I can do by going to my DNS registrar. So I have a screenshot of my DNS registrar here, Namecheap, and you can see that I have created that CNAME record as recommended in Application Proxy. Now we want to test this and find out whether it works externally. But before we can do that, we need to give access to users and groups. So I'll add the same user for testing purposes. So on an externally connected computer, I'm going to check out that link and see if it works. So I need to log in to Entra first, and once I've done that, I can see that the application is showing externally, and because the internal and external URLs match, I don't seem to have any problems with link translation. But you'll notice that what I just did was log in as a different user on my Entra ID, but then I logged in as myself on the application itself, because the application has its own authentication method. So in order to test how we can sort this out in terms of Entra, I'm going to configure this application to also use Entra as its authentication system. Because this is specific to this app, I've done this in the background. It's something that you need to read the documentation for each application, but what you'll notice here is that I've got a login to Microsoft Azure, and I've logged in as the other user now, and when I click this button now, it will take me in as the user that I logged in initially as. Right, lastly, what we're going to do is really a cosmetic end user type thing, which is we can add these apps to the app launcher so that it's easier for users to find the app itself. and that's configured within Enterprise Applications and New Collection. I'll give it a name so that our users can find it, and this will be stechsystems.apps, and I'll find those apps here. One is the intranet one and the other one is the Knowledgebase one. This is an optional step, but it does make it easier for users to actually find the apps that you've published. Okay, and now if I go to myapps.microsoft.com, you'll see that I've got a separate collection there and it's got the apps, and this will mean that the user can just go in directly to the apps without having to put in any URLs or anything like that. So it's very user friendly. So let's take a recap of what we've done. We installed the connector agent. As I mentioned, I tried it on server core, it didn't work. Maybe that's going to be sorted out in the future. For now, it needs to be on a desktop experience version of Windows Server. The app configuration itself, you need to make sure that you've got DNS working internally, and you also need to make sure that where you install the installer connector, it has visibility to those internal apps. When testing externally, what we found was that the intranet web app had problems with the URLs, and we turned on translate URLs in the application body to resolve that issue. But if we want to do this in a production environment, we really should be matching the URLs internally and externally. So that would be work that you would do to the internal app first, and then do this Entra App Proxy access. And then finally, we added the apps to the app launcher experience so that it's easier for our end users to find the apps that we want them to have access to. In the end, I have to say I'm pretty impressed with Entra App Proxy. Without using a VPN, without doing lots of complicated configuration or firewall rules, we can publish our apps knowing that they're secure using Entra ID. And so I would actually recommend that if you do have internal apps in your company and you want to publish them externally without the use of a VPN, you should try this out and see if it works for your apps. The key points here is that it is very easy to set up, and it does reduce the complexity for your support engineers, and it manages everything in one place, which is Entra Admin Portal. It uses identity for authentication, so it's secure, and it uses industry standard best practices. Lastly, this way of publishing internal web apps improves your security posture within the company.